Back again with us this morning, Major Glenn Ignacio, retired U.S. Air Force Special Operations Commander and President of Limiting Factors, LLC. Good to have you with us. Is the president's messaging strong enough for Vladimir Putin?
Well, I hope so. I also think that the actions with a lot of our deployments that are really beefing up the border, say in Poland and so forth, I think that the action is really what's important versus the words. That's how Putin really responds to things, is by action and by strength. And we have put a lot of forces on those particular borders just in case something spills over from Ukraine, and hope that is good enough to intimidate him from any kind of further action.
And that is if NATO is targeted, any member of NATO. But what happens if he deploys a nuclear weapon within Ukraine?
That'll be the interesting part. Some of these tactical nuclear weapons have a sort of short half-life. So, you're looking at a week of radiation that would expand, or at least would last within Ukraine. But that's really one of the things, is that you have now escalated this to a nuclear capable type of conflict. Would we respond in kind? Man, that would be really dangerous. And again, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so NATO may not respond accordingly. But boy, how do you contain that type of nuclear assault? That would really be something of a contention, especially with NATO being right there on the border.
Major, what do you make of these latest reports of the frustration growing, not just in Moscow, but within the Kremlin, about the status of the war and some of the casualties that Russia has experienced with its military effort?
Yeah, they've been extensive. And remember, we had this 300,000 call up recently, and these are troops that are or at least they're not going to be trained whatsoever. I mean, we saw conscripts in the beginning, which was a huge slaughter for Russia. Then we had some seriously trained soldiers that were also beat up. And this 300,000, which did not go over well within Russia, is not going to be good for them. There's going to be extensive losses. There's also an interesting point within the propaganda mechanism of Russia, is a lot of the news agencies are starting to not quite support Putin and really question the actions in Ukraine. However, they're saying that the West and NATO is the cause for the war, so they are still balancing that. But it is nice to see that internally there's some, some issues.
The landscape of the battlefield is going to change come winter. What are the biggest concerns as we see Ukraine gain a lot of momentum when we see the weather shift?
With the weather shifting, it's definitely going to be a concern as far as gear, winter gear. That's one of the things that we've been requested when I was over there, and currently with teammates over there, that having that winter gear to prepare for the brutal cold is going to be important. As I mentioned to you yesterday, it's making sure also that the Ukrainians do not overextend themselves, to make sure that the logistics chain is there to supply their operations. That's really key for the war itself. And with this, we see the Russians really pulling back. You got to remember, they're now at their home and they have to prepare for that winter. And it's definitely harder to do when you're considered abroad and outside the confines of Russia.
Obviously, they've been hit on multiple levels. Russia has in this war, trying to gain more territory in Ukraine. We're seeing the Ukrainians with the upper hand right now. Do you feel like the tide has shifted? Is this a war of attrition, or do you think that Russia is quickly running out of steam?
Well, it's definitely running out of steam, and there has been significant gains. I mean, they've lost about another 10%. So you saw, again, in the northeast, south of Kharkiv and Lyman, as we mentioned yesterday, Lyman is really key for logistics and communication. They lost that, and there's an incredible front towards the south, which is actually south of Mykolaiv in the Kherson area. That was one of the biggest strongholds that Russia held. So these strong areas that Russia has said is now their territory are really being, the penetration of the Ukrainian forces have been significant. So Russia's losses have been significant and Ukraine's gains have been phenomenal, but it's still a lot of effort to push them completely out of Ukraine, and that could take many months.
Yeah, Putin showing no signs of backing down. Major Glenn Ignacio, good to have you with us as always. Thank you.
You bet. Have a good morning. Thanks, Marty.
You too. All right, so what's it like